Welcome to Team European Union's Climate Change Stakeholder video presentation. In this video, we will be talking about what climate change is, how climate change is affecting the European Union, how the European Union is affecting climate change, what is being done by the European Union to solve this issue, and what can be done to solve this issue. A large number of the issues caused by climate change involve global warming. In order to find solutions to the problems caused by global warming, we first need to know what causes this to happen. Ultraviolet rays from the sun enter the Earth's atmosphere and are then reflected by the Earth. Some of the gases in the atmosphere, for example carbon dioxide, are able to block the reflected ultraviolet rays from escaping and thereby trap them within the atmosphere. As the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, so does the amount of ultraviolet rays unable to escape. This causes the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere to increase and is the cause of the phenomenon called global warming. By burning fossil fuels, humans are releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every day. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased by more than a third since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The data from the centuries prior to this shows that the concentration of carbon dioxide remained relatively stable at about 280 parts per million. The current concentration in our atmosphere is 409 parts per million. It is predicted that if we can reduce our global carbon emissions to zero by around the year 2060, the global temperature should not increase anymore, but remain steady. Oceans play a big part in the role of global warming. They act as a carbon sink by absorbing large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. As more and more carbon dioxide is being dissolved into the oceans, the rate at which it is being absorbed is slowing down, as the concentration in the ocean is nearing the maximum capacity. This causes a decrease in the amount of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere, which leads to a rapid increase in the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The oceans have also stored over 90% of the excess heat produced by global warming. The average ocean temperature has risen by 0.11 degrees Celsius every decade since 1971. Because of this rise in temperature, the water in the oceans expands, and so, coupled with the effect of warmer water melting ice, the sea levels rise.
The effects of climate change within the European Union will only become more severe as time goes on. France has already experienced an annual average temperature increase of 0.95 degrees Celsius, compared to the average global temperature increase of only 0.74 degrees Celsius. Summers are undoubtedly getting warmer, and in winter, the number of days with extreme temperatures are decreasing. This will result in a huge increase of heat waves and a reduction in cold spells. The north of France is facing increased precipitation, while the south are facing longer droughts. More specifically, the French Alps are seeing an alarming decrease in snow levels, with some areas seeing as much as 50% decrease in snow depth. France's overseas territories are mostly insular, so as such are particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts such as sea level rise. Across the majority of Germany, the rural population are facing a decline in groundwater levels within the summer, especially in the western regions. The groundwater levels are essential to the ecosystem survival and maintaining fertile crops. Furthermore, the primary source of drinking water is groundwater, making up 66.5%. A threat of increased forest fires has also elevated, particularly in the southwestern and northeastern regions, and a greater risk of flooding in the rainy autumn season is a continuous threat across Germany's 5 major river systems. Poland is found in a particularly significant place in Europe because it is situated between polar, tropical, maritime, and continental air masses and temperate climate zones. This means that the north is becoming increasingly infected by heat, and the south by water restrictions causing droughts. Evapotranspiration has exceeded the amount of rainfall in some parts of the country, making water management an increasing concern. A sector of the EU that has been heavily affected by climate change is the agricultural sector, where the quality of crops are directly affected by climate variables and CO2 levels. Within northern, colder nations, growing seasons lengthen, creating more yield, but there's less time to maintain the seasonal processes throughout the year. In contrast to the higher temperatures of the southern, warmer nations, add further strain to the crops and their water supplies. Thus, both the long-term and immediate production of agriculture are directly affected through the soaring prices and, in some instances, job loss. Tourism is another industry directly affected by climate change. Poland's northern coast is one of the country's hotspots. However, the increase in temperature means there is less ice in winter, protecting the coast from erosion of its soft sandy beaches. The Baltic area not only brings in a lot of money from tourism, but also to the ports, harbours, shipyards, and other highly industrial areas. Other concerns include the continuing sea level rise and erosion, which will displace individuals living along the cliff edges. This is estimated to be as high as 230,000 people. The increase of temperature will also result in a decrease in winter sport tourism in 2,000 regions across France and Germany. If a temperature increase of 4.5 degrees occurs by the year 2100, all German ski areas will be permanently free of snow. Tourism makes up 9% of France's GDP and will be undoubtedly hit in the future. France's overseas territories are already facing issues, as seen in French Polynesia, where seaside hotels are beginning construction of sea walls to combat the imminent effects of erosion and rising sea levels.
What is the EU currently trying to do for climate change? Amongst many climate change policies that the European Union have implemented on its countries, a constant goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The main goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep a global temperature rise 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. However, one of the other key elements of the Paris Agreement is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 20% below 1990 levels by the year 2020. In order to do this, the EU is currently increasing their use of renewable energy, including wind, solar, hydro, and biomass. Another climate change policy in use throughout the EU is the European Union Adaptation Strategy, which prepares for the impacts of climate change. The strategy encourages member states to adopt reliable adaptation strategies, which 21 member states have already done. Some of these guidelines include using less water, adapting building regulations, and building flood defences. Another strategy includes climate-proofing actions in order to adapt sectors to the change in climate. Sectors such as agriculture, infrastructure, tourism, and energy production will be affected, so these actions will help ensure that they are more resilient. These strategies will help to defend the Union against the effects of climate change. The European Union's role in helping to prevent climate change has resulted in being viewed as somewhat leaders. Through multiple scenes over the last several years, the EU have developed and implemented policies for themselves and stakeholders worldwide to help with the ongoing problem of climate change. In doing this, they have self-titled themselves as the international agenda setter in relationships to climate change mitigation. The main focus of the Climate Change Leadership Program is to encourage other stakeholders to get involved and to further reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, specifically in the transportation sector. According to American politician and environmentalist Albert Gore, he states, "The EU had an absolutely critical leadership role to play in helping the world make the changes it must." In addition to what the European Union as a whole is doing for climate change, a few of the countries are working within themselves and implementing strategies in order to work on one country at a time. A graph conducted by Carbon Market Watch illustrates the EU climate leaderboard as according to where each country stands on the effort sharing regulation. The top 3 countries include Sweden, Germany, and France, with a score of 67%, 54%, and 53% respectively. In the last 40 years, France has implemented an energy program that has significantly reduced its dependency on oil. The production of nuclear energy, which represents 80% of the energy produced in France, has successfully reduced greenhouse gas emissions. France advocated an ambitious position in the EU with a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 and 60% by 2040. Greenhouse gas emissions per person are already among the lowest of developed countries. On July 25, 2015, 78% of Germany's electricity was generated by renewable energy sources, which was possible due to strong wind from storms in the north and also sunny in the south at the same time, where most of the country's solar panels are placed. Germany invested 120 billion euros into low-pollution energy in the past decade, and the share of electricity generated by renewable sources has increased to 28%, which is more than any other source. In addition, Sweden's strength lies in their citizen engagement and public awareness in regards to climate change and current solutions. Sweden accounts for less than 0.2% of total global emissions, and they have also moved to less carbon-intensive means of producing energy with the inclusion of energy-efficient plans for households. The electricity certificate system, initiated in 2003, is a market-based support system to increase the production of renewable electricity and make the production more cost-efficient.
Issues with solutions to climate change. Climate change is an issue affecting us which requires a complex solution. Hence, many potential solutions would prove ineffective as they only address a single contributing factor to the effects of climate change. Agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement use a reduction of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions as a way to reduce the effects of climate change by lowering temperatures. Reducing carbon dioxide emissions would not solve the issue of climate change, as this only deals with one gas, neglecting the other greenhouse gases such as methane, nitrous oxide and carbon particles. Reduction of emissions would have a muted effect, as not all countries are a part of these agreements. Since global warming is a global issue, a local solution is inadequate. Even amongst the countries signed up to the agreement, not all share the same target for emissions reductions, thus also causing a muted effect. If greenhouse gas emissions entirely stopped tomorrow, we would still be affected by the effects of climate change. This is due to a buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This would take many years to dissipate enough that the effects of climate change will be reduced. For this reason, climate change agreements have insignificant effect, but will be of greater benefit to future generations. Enough greenhouse gases are currently present in the atmosphere that a 2.2 to 4 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature is unavoidable. For emissions to entirely cease, energy dependency would need to be placed upon renewable energy sources. Large amounts of land are required for solar and wind farms. This would overtake valuable farmland, habitats and housing. Additionally, solar and wind farms are intermittent sources of energy, which would in turn need to be paired with either a battery system or another system that can provide continuous energy. To make solar and wind main sources of energy would be dependent on funding. In 2013, Spain generated 20.9% of its total electricity from wind turbines. This was dependent on funding and became endangered by talk to remove subsidies which made this possible. Hence, to move to 100% of energy by wind or other renewables would put even greater strain on funding. Not only would electricity generation need to be placed upon non-combustion based sources, but vehicles and other motor-driven devices will need to be run from electrical or other types of engines. This would require great expense to change this equipment, which would be a problem for governments and citizens to afford. Nuclear is another potential clean energy source, which can also provide continuous power. However, current fission reactors produce dangerous nuclear waste with a long half-life. To make nuclear a safe source, fusion technology must be developed. However, this is also dependent on funding, and is still not ready as a means to produce electricity, adding a further delay to become reliant on clean and renewable energy sources, further delaying the reduction of the effects of climate change.
Heading into the future, the EU is setting out new goals for combating climate change. The European Commission has created the Low Carbon Economy Roadmap, setting out a plan up to 2050. The main goal of the roadmap is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to 80% below the levels from 1990. Milestones have been set out to achieve this goal. By 2030, they aim to cut greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below that of 1990, as well as a 27% increase in energy efficiency and a target of 27% total energy consumption coming from renewable energies. To help achieve this goal, Continued research into new, clean technologies will be very important. The EU must continue their progress towards a low-carbon society, embracing these new advancements. The roadmap aims to be a cost-effective pathway to cutting emissions, acknowledging that early action can save extensive costs later if little action is taken. To achieve these goals, all sectors will need to make changes in accordance to their financial and technological potential. It is crucial they put themselves in the best position to make the transition to a low-carbon society. The most important change will come from the 6 main sectors within the EU: power, transport, buildings, industry, agriculture, and construction. Each sector has different expectations placed upon them as to exactly how much reduction they can achieve. Power has the biggest potential to cut their emissions. They believe they can almost entirely eradicate their CO2 emissions by 2050. They also aim to partially replace fossil fuels within heating and transport. Electricity will increasingly be coming from renewable sources, especially solar, wind, water, and biomass. Other sources will include low-emission energies, such as nuclear power plants and fossil fuel power stations, which make use of carbon capture and storage technologies. In order to achieve these goals, they will need to ensure a strong investment in technologies such as smart grids. Over the next 4 decades, the EU will need to invest an extra €270 billion, roughly 1.5% of its annual GDP, in order to successfully make this transition. It appears that these are achievable targets for the EU. The EU successfully completed the first Kyoto emission target, which had a goal of an annual reduction of 8% below 1990s levels. Their actual achieved cut is estimated to have been 12.2%. Since 2004, EU emissions have continued to fall annually, with their emission estimated at being 18% below 1990s levels in 2012. Meanwhile, their GDP has grown by 45% between 1990 to 2011. The second Kyoto period, spanning 2013 to 2020, involves a commitment from the EU to have an annual reduction of 20% below 1990s emissions levels. The EU appears to be within reach of achieving this 20% goal, with projections showing their reduction to be at 21% below 1990 by 2020.